This happened several years ago. A 25-year-old man named James went trekking alone in a remote part of the sprawling Cherokee National Forest, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. James was a pretty experienced backpacker. Spending a few days alone in the deep woods wasn't anything new for him. But what happened that day changed his entire life. On the afternoon of the second day of his trek, the weather suddenly started turning bad and fast. Within moments, the sky filled with thick black clouds and a fierce, gusting wind kicked up. As heavy rain came down and lightning kept striking again and again nearby, James realized there was no way he could survive the night camped out in the open forest. He needed to find solid shelter, and fast. Through the blurry curtain of rain, he spotted a small, old, single-story wooden cabin some distance away. With a bit of relief, James headed toward the cabin and pounded on the door. It was unlocked. Stepping inside, he saw an old wooden chair in one corner, a small table, and a run-down bed frame. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for a long time, but one thing caught his eye. On the bed sat a sleeping bag, clean and fairly new. Next to it lay a pair of muddy shoes. It looked like someone had been here recently. James decided to change out of his wet clothes and rest for a while. But as the light started to fade, his eyes landed on the inside of the door's wood. The door was covered in deep scratch marks, like someone had clawed at the wood in desperation, trying to claw their way out. Looking closer, James felt his chest go cold. There was no lock or latch on the inside of the door. It was set up to be padlocked from the outside. Even the single glass window had been boarded up tight from the outside with wooden planks and screws. The inner window frame had the same kind of deep scratch marks. Looking at it, James got the feeling that someone had once been forcibly locked inside this cabin. Right at that moment, even over the roar of the storm outside, a strange sound drifted in. Something or someone was scratching hard against the cabin's outer wooden wall. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps from the direction of the porch. Then, something metal moved outside the door. James went to the door and tried to turn the handle, and that's when he realized it wouldn't open. Someone had padlocked it from outside. He pounded on the door and shouted, demanding to know who was out there, but no answer came, only the roar of the storm. A few seconds later, James tried to look outside through the gap under the door. In a flash of lightning, he caught a blurry glimpse of a human shadow on the porch. The person wasn't trying to break the door down. Instead, it seemed like he was making sure the door was securely locked from the outside. After a while, the heavy footsteps slowly moved off into the distance. That's when James realized someone had deliberately locked him inside this cabin. Grasping how dangerous his situation was, James immediately started searching for another way out. But before he could do anything, there was a loud, heavy impact against the wooden planks outside the back window. In an instant, the glass shattered, and something like a burning cloth came flying through the gap in the planks and landed inside the cabin. The moment it hit the floor, James caught a strong smell of kerosene. Within seconds, fire spread across the dry wooden floor. Thick smoke began filling the inside of the cabin. As the fire quickly spread toward the window's wooden frame and the walls, James realized he couldn't stay there one more second. Desperate, he ran for the door and threw his whole body against it, again and again. Even though it was padlocked from outside, the old wooden door weakened after several hits. On his last hit, James pushed with everything he had, and part of the door broke apart. He burst through, out, into the open, through the fire and smoke. Without stopping for even a second, he took off running deeper into the forest. As he ran through the rain, trying to escape deeper into the woods, the attacker suddenly came at him from behind and tackled him with brutal force. In the driving rain and darkness, James couldn't get a clear look at the man's face. His strength was unnatural. The two of them wrestled violently in the mud. James was knocked down several times, but desperate to survive, he kept getting back up. At one point, he managed to shove the man away hard enough to knock him off balance and send him to the ground. James used that moment to run, blindly, as fast as he could. He didn't hear any more sounds behind him, but he didn't stop. A short distance away, James found an open space under the roots of a huge tree that had been uprooted by the storm. With no other safe shelter around, he curled up and decided to spend the night there. He waited the whole night, shivering every so often, along with the distant sound of thunder. It felt like someone was walking through the forest, but he didn't dare take any more risks before dawn. As dawn broke and the rain let up a little, James started walking again. After walking for quite a while, he finally reached a main trailhead. A few hikers spotted him there. Seeing his burned clothes, his mud-soaked body, and the wounds on his neck and arms, they quickly got him emergency help. James was later taken to the hospital. He had second-degree burns on his arms and the back of his neck, which took a long time to heal. While he was being treated at the hospital, James told the police the whole story, based on the last location saved on his GPS device and his description of the area around the cabin. A search team later made their way there, but they didn't find any part of the cabin still standing. The entire wooden structure had burned to ash. Around the wreckage, they found nothing much besides a few pieces of burned metal. They also never found any reliable lead on the identity or whereabouts of the man James described. Even after the investigation, one question was never answered. If the cabin James had taken shelter in was truly abandoned, then why was there such a clean, fairly new sleeping bag inside, and whose muddy shoes were lying next to it? An even more frightening question: had someone been in that cabin just a little while before James got there? James has never gone camping or trekked alone in the deep woods again since that day, but the memory of that day still haunts him, especially those moments when he was trapped inside the burning cabin and the unknown man standing outside wouldn't let him out. To this day, he doesn't know who that man really was, why he was locked in the cabin and set on fire, or, the biggest question of all, who that new sleeping bag actually belonged to. They say silence in old, abandoned places is never really empty. This happened a few years ago. Deep in the thick pine forests of northern Oregon stood a fire lookout tower that had been abandoned for many years. The metal structure rose almost 70 feet, and its upper cabin used to be where forest rangers watch for wildfires, but it had been useless and abandoned for decades. Marvin and his old friend Charles shared a particular hobby, exploring empty, off-limits places like this one. One Friday afternoon, carrying nothing but 2 backpacks and some basic gear, they set out down the rough trail into the forest. Their plan was to spend the night in the small wood and metal cabin at the top of the tower. And needless to say, deep in that forest, their phones had no signal at all. There was no way to reach anyone outside. By the time they reached the tower, the dim light of dusk was thickening around them. The structure looked worn down and rickety. They had to climb a shaky, rusted staircase and then a long metal ladder that went almost straight up to reach the cabin. Every step made the old iron groan under their boots, and the air smelled of wet earth and rusted metal. Slowly, struggling with each step, they finally made it up into the tower's cabin, and once there, they took in a beautiful view of the sunset spreading over the endless forest around them. After the sun went down, a heavy silence settled over the whole forest. It was so quiet that they could pick out the sound of distant insects clearly. In that deep silence, wanting to break the mood with a little fun, Charles took the heavy metal water flask in his hand and struck it hard against the tower's metal frame. The loud clang tore through the stillness of the forest and echoed far into the distance. For a while, the two of them just listened as the echo slowly faded away. It happened shortly after that. Standing on the open deck of the cabin and looking down, Marvin's eyes caught something strange. Deep in the forest, through the gaps between the massive pine trees, a light was glowing. It wasn't flickering or swaying the way an ordinary flashlight or lantern would. It didn't move up and down against the trees the way a light carried by a walking person would. Instead, it appeared through the gaps in the trees, sometimes clearly, sometimes only partly visible, as a single, steady sphere of light. It seemed to float just above the ground, drifting slowly toward the tower. For almost 10 minutes, the light moved slowly through the forest. Sometimes it disappeared behind a pine tree for a few seconds, only to reappear through the gap of another. But every single time, Marvin felt certain the light was heading straight toward them. At one point, it came to a stop directly at the base of the tower. Charles leaned over the railing of the deck, staring into the darkness below, and shouted, "Who's there?" No answer came. He called out again. Still, nothing. No human voice, no footsteps, not even the rustle of leaves came from below. The light stayed completely still too, as if Charles's shout never even reached it. Then, without any sound or warning, the light simply vanished. 1 second it was glowing there, and the next, nothing remained but deep darkness. It wasn't like a light slowly dimming out, and it wasn't like something moving behind a tree. It was as if someone had switched it off in an instant. Gripped by an unknown fear, the two of them rushed inside the cabin, shut the heavy wooden door, and sat down inside. About 20 minutes after they went inside, the real strangeness began. At first, they heard a very faint sound. Then, it slowly grew clearer. From the metal structure below the tower came a horrible grinding noise, like a heavy piece of iron being dragged across another piece of iron. Then, suddenly, a sharp, screeching sound rang out. After a few seconds of silence, the grinding sound started up again. Then came another metallic clang. The sounds seemed to come from different parts of the tower, as if something unseen were slowly moving across the structure below them. Every now and then, the entire 70-foot structure gave a light shudder. Marvin and Charles looked at each other without saying a word. Neither of them had the courage to look outside and see what was happening. Just then, Marvin's eyes suddenly shifted toward the cabin's window. Right at that moment, a pitch-black shape shot past the glass. At first, Marvin thought maybe it was just a large bird or a tree branch swaying in the wind. But a moment later, he realized that wasn't it. The shape had passed so close to the window that, for one instant, he'd clearly seen its size. And yet, there was no platform or structure outside the cabin at that height for anything to stand on. Where the shape had come from, or where it had disappeared to, Marvin had no idea. They spent the rest of the night frozen in fear in a corner of the cabin. The grinding metal sounds kept coming, sometimes close, sometimes far away. At times, it seemed like the sound had stopped right beneath the cabin. Then, a few minutes later, a metallic clanging would drift over from some distant part of the structure. Neither of them opened the door. Neither of them dared to look outside. At dawn, as the first dim light began to show through the trees, they finally worked up the courage to leave the cabin. They still had no explanation for what had happened during the night. All they could think about was getting down as fast as possible and making it back to the car. But as they reached the staircase, their hearts went cold. 3 or 4 steps of the tower staircase had come loose from the structure and hung tilted downward. Several thick metal bolts had been bent and torn apart, as if something with an unnatural amount of force had ripped them out of the frame. In an instant, they understood the meaning of that long, grinding metal sound from the night before. The gap left by those 3 or 4 missing steps wasn't very large, but crossing it this high up on an old, rusted structure was extremely risky. Charles hesitated at first, but in the end he jumped, trying to clear the gap. His foot didn't land right on the other side, and he lost his balance, crashing into the metal below. A sharp pain shot through his ankle, but he somehow managed to steady himself. Marvin held on to him and helped him slowly make his way down the rest of the stairs. Then the two of them staggered away from the tower and ran for their car as fast as they could, terrified, and made it out alive. To this day, neither Marvin nor Charles has ever found a clear answer for what happened that night. How the light had come from deep in the forest, why it had suddenly vanished right at the base of the tower, how that black shape had shot past the cabin window, and how the heavy iron steps of the tower staircase had been torn loose and ripped apart in the dark. None of it they've ever been able to explain. But there's one thing the two of them still remember to this day. That evening, when Charles had jokingly struck the tower's metal frame with his flask, the sound of it had echoed across the entire forest. And not long after that, the light had come out of the darkness of the forest and moved toward the tower. Even now, on a quiet night, if Marvin suddenly hears a metallic grinding sound, his chest tightens without warning. Ever since that night, he's understood that not every sound has a cause you can see, and some silences, once broken, never go back to being what they were before. It was back in 2009. This story, about an experienced camper named Gary, might sound at first like just an ordinary forest experience. But once you hear the whole thing through to the end, you'll understand that behind the nature we think we know, there can be strange mysteries hiding, the kind that don't always come with an easy explanation. Gary was close to 30 years old at the time. He had been tracking and camping in the woods for almost 15 years. In the first few years, though, he only went out with family members or experienced friends. Later on, going deep into the forest alone became a habit for him, what we'd call backcountry solo camping. That was his favorite kind of trip. Eastern Kentucky's Daniel Boone National Forest was a place he knew well, too. Once you step into that massive forest, for miles and miles, you'd struggle to find any sign of a human settlement, let alone another person. Wanting to get away from the intense pressure of work for a few days, he decided this time to head into the woods alone for 3 nights. For safety, he brought along his trusted .308 bolt-action rifle. On the first day, after about 5 miles of hiking over hilly trails and thick brush, he pitched his tent beside a dry creek bed. The spot sat a little low, surrounded on all sides by tall trees and dense brush. In the daylight, the place seemed safe enough. After a tiring day of walking, Gary ate dinner, crawled into his tent, and fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up with a strange, heavy feeling. It wasn't a sound that woke him. It was the unnatural silence all around him. Peeking out through the thin fabric of his tent, he saw, about 200 yards away through a gap in the thick trees, the glow of a campfire burning. The flames were rising fairly high, flickering now and then in the wind. Gary's first thought was that maybe another camper had set up nearby for the night. To remember the fire's location, he made a mental note of a bent pine tree in front of him and the dry creek bed as landmarks and went back to sleep. The next morning, coffee mug in hand, Gary went out of curiosity to check out the spot where he'd seen the fire the night before. Following the direction he remembered, he tracked the line of trees and the bent pine tree and made his way forward. But when he reached the exact spot, he stopped cold. There was no fire pit, no ash, no burnt wood, not even a ring of stones. The ground was completely untouched. There wasn't so much as a single scorch mark on the dew-covered leaves and grass. There weren't even a few dry sticks lying around that could have been used to start a fire. And yet, the night before, he had seen the flames so clearly that there was no way to write it off as some trick of the light. The whole thing struck Gary as strange, but he didn't cut his trip short. Even with some unease about the place, he pressed on deeper into the forest as planned. On the evening of the second day, he set up another camp about 4 miles from where he'd camped the first night, deep in the forest. From there, the way back to his car was about 9 miles. That night, too, there was no sign of anyone else around. There was almost no wind at all. Even the leaves on the trees stayed completely still. Then, in the middle of the night, Gary was jolted awake by a loud, cracking sound, a massive tree crashing down. The sound was so loud that it felt to him like the ground itself had shaken. He sat up immediately and grabbed his rifle. He waited inside the tent for a while. Exactly 10 minutes later, another huge tree came crashing down, this time from a completely different direction. Now Gary realized this could be a coincidence, or it could be something else entirely. Not daring to step outside the tent, he sat staring into the darkness. Then the silence of the forest broke again. Carried on the wind came a long, low, deep, growling sound. Gary couldn't match it to the call of any animal he knew. It didn't sound like it was coming from very close by, but it didn't sound far off either. After a few seconds, the strange sound stopped, and the whole forest went quiet again, just like before. Gary couldn't manage to sleep properly for the rest of the night. As soon as morning light broke, rifle in hand, he made his way toward the tree that had fallen the night before. As he got close to it, a chill ran through his body. The massive trunk showed none of the usual signs of a natural crack or rot. Instead, along one side of the wood, there were several deep, long gouges running side by side, as if something unnaturally strong had violently torn into the wood with sharp claws or some hard object. The marks were so deep that Gary couldn't easily explain them by thinking of any animal he knew. But what he found lying at the base of the tree frightened him even more. Lying on the damp ground was a blue handkerchief and a metal carabiner. Gary recognized both items right away. They were his own belongings. The handkerchief had been kept in an inner pocket of his backpack, and the carabiner had been clipped to one of the gear loops on his bag. He clearly remembered putting both items away in their places the night before, right before going to sleep. Gary had left his backpack in the vestibule just outside the tent door. That morning, when he opened up the tent, he'd noticed the outer zipper of the vestibule was slightly open at the bottom. When he checked his bag afterward, what struck him as strangest of all was this. There were no tears or cut marks on the bag anywhere. The zipper on the inner pocket was still closed, just as it had been before, but the handkerchief inside it was gone, and the carabiner had been fastened to the gear loop in a way that made it impossible for it to have come loose on its own, which meant that if someone had taken the two items out, they would have had to unzip the outer part of the tent, come right up close to the bag, and do it completely silently. and Gary had been sleeping just a few inches away, right on the other side of the tent fabric. That realization was what scared him the most. If he really had failed to notice some unknown animal or person getting that close to him while he slept the night before, then it could just as easily have taken more of his things. But why just these two items? And why were they left at the base of that fallen tree? Gary couldn't find an answer. Shaking with fear, he didn't want to stay there another moment. He quickly packed up his gear, broke down the tent, and started the 9-mile hike back. But the whole way, he had an uneasy feeling. Again and again, it felt like something was following him from behind the trees. Whenever he stopped, it seemed like something else stopped too. When he started walking again, he'd hear a very faint sound on the dry leaves somewhere in the distance. He looked back several times, but never saw anyone, just rows of trees and deep shadow. By the afternoon, Gary somehow made it to his car. Once he was a safe distance away, he called the police and told them the whole story. After hearing about the location and the items he'd found, the police suggested it was probably some kind of wild animal. In their view, there likely wasn't any connection between the fallen tree and the missing items from his bag. As for the strange growling Gary described, they assumed that was just the call of some large animal too. But Gary knew that what he had seen and felt wasn't something that could be explained away that easily. Even after all that, Gary didn't give up camping. He still carries the .308 rifle with him. But after that incident, his whole outlook on spending the night deep in the woods changed, especially when it comes to seeing a distant firelight at night. He never again assumes it's just some ordinary camper out there, because on that night back in 2009, he saw a fire that, come morning, left behind no trace it had ever existed. And the following night, something got close enough to his camp that it managed to take items out of his bag, while Gary, asleep the whole time, never noticed a thing. To this day, Gary doesn't know where that fire came from. He doesn't know how those two trees really fell. And most of all, he doesn't know who or what took that blue handkerchief and metal carabiner out of his bag and left them at the base of that tree. Maybe there's a natural explanation for all of it. Maybe that unknown growl was just some animal's call, and the claw marks on the tree had an ordinary cause too. But there's one question Gary still doesn't have an answer to. That night, while he lay sleeping soundly inside his tent, just how close did it come?